This episode of New Politics was released on the 4th of May, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, domestic violence against women is in the spotlight and the media decides it's better to report on who said what in Canberra. And should we have any sympathy for Scott Morrison suffering from anxiety when he made so many cutbacks to mental health services when he was Prime Minister? I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, disaster of a human being.
And just our regular message, if you'd like to support New Politics, you can support us through Patreon or Substack, or you can go to newpolitics.com.au and purchase one of our books. And all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. Domestic violence has been in the headlines this week, and it started off with the No More rally, which was held in Canberra last Sunday and in other parts around Australia. Domestic violence against women and children is a massive issue in Australia, and governments of all persuasions have been very slow to act in this area. And there's been report after report to go through this major issue. And the last major report on domestic violence was released in October 2022, and that was the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. But reports are not enough. Further inquiries are not enough, and there needs to be more serious levels of action from government. And there's been a huge partisan debate and a political debate about the No More rallies and whether the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese should have been there or not, and whether he hijacked the event or not. And the upshot is that there was a National Cabinet meeting held this week. There's been an announcement of $925 million to help victims of violence leave abusive relationships. There's also a proposed ban on deepfake porn and violent pornography. These are announcements, and it's better to have more funding going into domestic violence programs than less, but you can have all the money in the world going into these programs, but if there isn't a cultural change within society about men perpetrating these abuses and crimes, it's just not going to make much of a difference.
Firstly, before I say anything else, I think it's great that they're starting to take things seriously and they've put in a fairly substantial chunk. To put it into some context, it's about 1/300th of the chunk that has gone into AUKUS. But nonetheless, it should go a long way into frontline services, and hopefully they'll do things like hire the number of people that they said they'd hire. I think they wanted 218 domestic violence specialists, and they've hired 17, something like that. Hopefully they can fill that gap, start to open shelters, safe spaces for women and children to get out of violent relationships. Calling it domestic violence does limit it a little bit. Obviously, a lot of it does happen domestically, and even calling it family violence, it's a broader issue than that too. Why can't a woman walk home safely from a train station without having keys in her hands, without crossing the road whenever she sees another man, or whenever she sees a man on the same side of the street? Why is the onus on the women to be safe rather than the men not to be dangerous? Calling it gendered violence too is something that I think is problematic in that it suggests that it's a two-way street. We also need policies into alcohol and gambling. I'm a teetotaler, so I'm very careful with what I say because I don't want people to think I look down on you for drinking alcohol when I don't. But also, I know that the vast majority of drinkers are responsible drinkers who have a safe amount, and most don't fall into violent rages. But there is a culture that is dying, I think, but is still there, of people drinking and then getting violent. Gambling is another issue. The enablement of gambling through advertising, through subtle forms of advertising. Whenever you turn on a sports show, there's a bookmaker there telling you about the odds. So the normalization of gambling. And again, for those of you who enjoy going down and playing with what you can afford and winning sometimes and losing it sometimes is fine. But there are those who put more than they can afford into the machines, into the sport games, into the horses, into the dogs. And we've seen time and time again people go to jail because they were so desperate for money. They embezzled from their company. They stole from their families. They made things difficult for themselves. And of course, financial stress is one of the things that leads to violence. Now, I'm not excusing anyone. Violence against women particularly is wrong. You're not a man if you do that. But if we can alleviate, firstly, things for women, make it easier for them to get out, make it easier for them to make it easy for them to get out. A lot of women stay in abusive relationships because it's too hard to get out. And there's a lot of judgment on that. There shouldn't be.
And there are those discussions about what are the solutions to reduce domestic violence. And for many issues in the community, for example, such as the road toll, the ambition is to get the road toll down to zero. That's what all the marketing is all about. We'll probably never get down to that level, but the ambition has to be to reduce domestic violence down to zero. There's far more women who die from domestic violence than there are from acts of terrorism. Yet there's never any question at all about the funding to the Australian Federal Police for anti-terrorism measures. And there's a wide range of information and solutions available out there about what to do to reduce domestic violence in Australia and improve women's safety. It's not confusing, it's not difficult to understand, but governments of all persuasions have been very slow to act. Here's Delia Donovan from Domestic Violence New South Wales talking about what needs to be done.
Well, what I think is we're probably all really sick and devastated having to continually have to talk about these murders and deaths across Australia. We are in a national emergency situation. We have, our sector's been crying out for support and funding. We will get small announcements around reforms, but reforms alone without cultural and systemic change means nothing. So as a sector, we're pretty frustrated, and we want to see the nation step up and take action, and our government step up and take action. We want more than words now. We want more than plans. We want to see action. We want to see accountability, and accountability is going to be key. And as a nation, we all have a role to play. Certainly with the pledge we launched a couple of months ago, it's about, everyone stepping up and not thinking domestic violence is over there, it doesn't involve me. It involves every single one of us. We've all got a role to play. What we see, how we act, facing up and educating ourselves about this issue, and knowing, even through the criminal justice system, it won't just be bail reform that will work. It will be, what does domestic and family violence look like through the courts? How are magistrates responding? How's the criminal justice response responding? And really thinking about what domestic violence looks like, how it plays out, and what does trauma-informed practice look like? How are we risk assessing situations? Are we listening to police when it comes to bail reform? Are we looking at the conditions of bail? Are we, there's so much that I think we need to consider, and there's broader, beyond a bail reform or beyond the odd announcement. We need big reform, and we need significant investment in this issue. Certainly the domestic violence sector just needs, at bottom base, 20% increase in funding. So we're certainly hoping our government's going to step up and actually fund the sector, because piecemeal announcements and reforms, we need that bigger piece. And I'm at the point now where I'm like, we've got to represent the people of Australia and ensure that people are safe in their homes, in their workplaces, in their schools, and in the community. Enough is absolutely enough.
And it's not just direct funding to domestic violence programs or improved court and legal services. There's other government programs that do influence domestic violence as well. Anthony Albanese refused to lift the poverty payment rates of JobSeeker when he got into office. There's still a lot of mutual obligation policies in place. He did increase the single mother payments to the pre-Julia Gillard levels, but there's not much else. Housing policy, or the slow progress on housing policy and social housing. There's all these different ways that government programs can alleviate domestic violence, and some of the indirect policies can actually make things better as well. And it's probably a big picture approach that the government has to take on, not just a piecemeal approach. And unfortunately, the big picture approach does take time. But I think that it's a case where women and children affected by domestic violence just can't afford to wait this long.
All the inquiries in the world, all the reports in the world, all the royal commissions in the world are just delaying. One wonders why. What we've found with domestic violence too, as much as some people would like to suggest it so, it is fairly consistent across all economic statuses across all suburbs and backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, etc., etc. It's a national problem. It's not a problem confined to one or two demographics.
And as far as the politics of the event of the rally is concerned, now rightly or wrongly, it probably doesn't get much worse for a Prime Minister. When Anthony Albanese finally got to speak to the audience, he did make a few key points about what the government is doing about domestic violence, but he rambled on for almost 10 minutes at this rally, highlighting all the money that is being spent on domestic violence.
Thanks very much. I do want to congratulate the organisers, including yourself, for organising this today, and for women right around the country who have mobilised to say enough is enough. And just as I left Parliament House during the demonstration that was held a couple of years ago, I'm proud to be here with women, men, boys and girls saying we want violence against women and children to stop. To be clear, we did ask to speak, myself and Katie, and were told that that wasn't possible, and that's fine. I respect the organisers' right to do that.
That's a full-out lie.
To do that. We're here today to demand that governments of all levels must do better, including my own, including every state and territory government. In the first two budgets, we've added $2.3 billion. In the time that we have been in government, we've allocated funding for 500 domestic violence workers. We now have 10 days paid domestic... I agree it's not enough. I said that. We need to do more.
And then having an arcane discussion about why domestic violence shouldn't be funded as an emergency. And then he said something about floods and fires, I think, for some strange reason. And sure, Albanese might have been treated unfairly and he was probably set up on all of this. But if you're going to turn up to an event such as a rally on domestic violence that's mainly women, you just got to make sure that you've got something meaningful to say. And I think this was a big political stuff-up. Albanese was shouting out, that's not true, when the organisers claimed that Albanese hadn't responded at all about the event. And when the organiser asked the crowd if Albanese should speak, he responded by saying, well, I am the Prime Minister. And again, this was taken out of context. Now, that doesn't really matter. Yes, he is the Prime Minister, and yes, he should have handled it much better. But whatever someone says about you in that type of situation, and whether it's totally incorrect or not, as Mayor Carcetti said in the TV series The Wire, you just have to eat that shit sandwich and move on. And maybe Albanese wasn't feeling very hungry at that time.
One of the notable things is that if you weren't there, you don't really know what happened. If you were there, you don't really know what happened too. And I don't think any side is deliberately lying, which is a big claim of politicians. But Ray Hadley recanted that Anthony Albanese said, I'm the Prime Minister and I run the joint. Now, Ray Hadley is no friend of the Prime Minister, so for him to actually come out and say, no, he didn't say that, is a big thing. I think, and I'm speaking in retrospect here, would for him to have graciously and politely have declined speaking and said something like, I'm here to listen, I don't need to speak, and sent up Katie Gallagher in his place, who was also there. Having said that, it's easy to make these calls. And in the same way, you might say the organiser should have jumped at the opportunity for the Prime Minister of the country to step up. And again, in retrospect, that's an easy thing to say. So, yeah, without being there, I'm loath to sort of say what will happen. I will say, though, people's opinion tended to divide along the lines of if they liked Anthony Albanese beforehand, they tended to defend him. If they didn't like Anthony Albanese beforehand, they tended to criticise. I don't know that he won anyone over, and I don't know that he lost anyone. The divide seemed to be, what do you think of Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister? And again, that's not to say that one side or the other is right or wrong. It's just how I noticed that it fell. And perhaps this shows that we've become way too partisan and binary in our discussions, that no one is looking for the subtlety and the nuance.
Oh, for sure. And that's one area that has been ignored within all of this. But aside from all of that, there is a lot more work that needs to be done in this area. There has been a 30% increase in domestic violence homicides this year. And there's been a substantial increase in incidents since COVID commenced in early 2020. But based on the evidence of government action over the past 20 years or so, governments only seem to act when they are forced to act, and that's usually through a combination of long-term activism and pressure that finally ends up with some results. But you would think that with an issue that affects 50% of the population, that governments would be doing more. And that's not to say that nothing has been done. Governments of all persuasions have provided funding, some more, some less, and they've actually increased funding in some cases, but it's either not enough funding or not the right type of funding. And there's also legal issues, there's bail issues, and there's repeat offender issues as well. And that's the nature of police work, where quite often not enough is being done to stop repeat offenders. And there's also issues within the legal system as well, but the statistics are quite damning. 1 in 6 women experience physical or sexual violence from their male partner. 1 in 4 women experience emotional abuse. 1 in 6 women have also experienced economic abuse or hardship related to domestic violence. And the cost to the economy has been estimated to be around $26 billion a year. So that's a large cost, and it's a lot of women and children that are affected. And as you mentioned before, David, it's not that cliche of lower socio-economic areas that are affected. It's across the board. It's high income earners, low income, medium income, it's Anglo, it's non-Anglo, it's white collar, it's blue collar. So it is a big issue that has been a big issue for some time, and better responses from governments need to happen right now.
It's time for action, not time for talk. The other thing too is Chris Spins held a summit on women's violence, or violence against women, in which it was all men and all religious leaders. It's the optics that matter there. Why didn't they have women there to say, this is the issue, this is the problem? In the media, I'm not hearing a lot from people such as Rosie Batty or Grace Tame. I'm sure they've got plenty to say, but we're mostly hearing from the politicians and those who aren't. The academic who spoke out on Q&A the other night. So Vincent Hurley made the point that had he not been a white, straight, middle-aged male, he wouldn't have been able to make the points he did, which is a problem. We're not listening to people who are affected.
How dare you? How dare you go into politics in an environment like this when one woman is murdered every 4 days, and all you two can do is immediately talk about politics? That is just disgraceful. Is it any wonder frontline services aren't getting the money that they want? You can talk about putting out billions of dollars. AUKUS cost $300 billion. You made the comment we need to listen more. For God's sake, how long do we have to listen to politicians like you and the rest of you high-horsing about we have to have a Royal Commission, we have to do this? If a male has a history of crimes of violence, of any form of domestic violence, coercion, physical, emotional, they should not have the presumption of bail. We want those poor girls up there from those high schools, 1 in every 4 of them are likely to be sexually assaulted after the age of 15. And you all sit here and pontificate about what we're doing. You're not doing enough. But for the immediate concern of the women here, they need to have that offender taken off the street to give them breathing space to get away to a women's refuge. Over the decades, all governments of all persuasions, state and federal, you have patient dumped people with mental health and drug issues onto the street, which are the underlying causes of domestic violence, and that is the common element. So you talk about domestic violence. It is more than just domestic violence. You don't need a Royal Commission. That money needs to go into frontline services now.
He also pointed out there's 1 woman murdered every 4 days at the moment. This is crisis level. This is much worse than coward punching, which was bad enough. We've got to fix it, and we've got to fix it now. Take it out of the hands of the politicians and put it into the hands of the social workers, the law enforcement who deal with this stuff, those who know.
Well, I guess that's another issue. And one of our listeners has asked the question. There are so many of these types of social issues that are so bleedingly obvious. Spend more money on the issue, fix it up. And the question is, why don't governments act on these types of major issues. And the issue is that governments rarely act on anything at all unless there's pressure from the public, and that's either through activists or NGOs doing their campaigning work, people contacting their local MP, or sometimes there's pressure coming in from the media, and it's a combination of all of those different factors that add to that pressure. And people might get the impression that it's all the work of government and MPs that make all of this happen. And unless you're a business lobbyist or coming in with vested interest, anything to do with social policy takes years of work to get things done. It's lobbying ministers, it's arguing the case with ministers, it's if your organisation can actually get a meeting with the minister, and you might spend a couple of years lobbying a minister and then there's a reshuffle. So you've got to start up from scratch. Governments and ministers have got a wide range of competing interests, and unless you've got a minister who's passionate about the cause, or the minister's got the ear of the Prime Minister, things just take a very, very, very long time. And that's why the Prime Minister doesn't move at all on increasing job seeker rates, even though he said that he would when he was in opposition. Unemployed people haven't got a strong enough voice in Parliament. Albanese wasn't as passionate about it once he became the Prime Minister. So doing something substantial about reducing domestic violence should be front and centre of a Labor government. And about 50% of caucus are women. And there's no point in making a big deal about gender equity within the caucus if they're not going to do anything about an issue that is so strongly demarcated by gender. And women's safety was a big issue that they talked about when they were in opposition. So I am surprised that there was this stumbling block this week, but maybe not when you consider how cocooned many MPs are from their electorates and from the public.
I mean, we could all find $380 billion straight away, for example. We could start to look at sensible defence issues or sensible defence spending. We could start to look at a whole range of politicians' salaries and how they are administered. Do they need such generous travel allowance? Even though that amount would end up being more symbolic, I think a serious government would look at how do we get out of AUKUS. I think AUKUS's contract has been breached, so I think you could get out of that. How do we defend ourselves? We don't need to buy more weapons. We need to do more talking and show more trust. How do we have a good parliament? We take out the incentives for spivs and routers to take a seat, and then we can focus on the important things. We're really to fix the violence issue. We've not only got to fix it in the short term, but we've got to change the culture. That means better education. That means better health systems, better support for everyone, a better justice system, but also explaining to people from an early age that it's never right. Changing the attitude of society, that can take a generation, but you do it by acting as quickly as you can. And then when our children grow or our grandchildren grow, they're under a different but better society. And isn't that what we all want?
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
What's it gonna take? What's it gonna take? What's it gonna take? 49 candles burn.
And now for our regular attacks on the media. And this overall event, was a storm created by the media, and generally governments won't act on anything until they have to, and unless there are political advantages in doing so. But if people think that the government is terrible and politicians are hopeless, the Australian media is even worse. Now, domestic violence, I think we can all agree, is a very important issue, and you'd expect that this would be one of those issues that the media could report on respectfully and professionally, but it just wasn't to be. This was started off on the Sunday at the No More rally in Canberra when The Guardian ran a story headlined, "Albanese heckled at Canberra rally to end violence against women." But when you read further into the article, it states that there were just a few people in the audience out of the thousands who were there who called out the government for not doing enough about men's violence. and rightly so. And looking at the videos, there's a few people calling out, but hardly enough to warrant a headline claiming that Albanese was heckled at the rally. And if anything, he seemed to be applauded for being there and coming up to the front of the rally to speak. So The Guardian ran with this headline, and then the ABC ran with the same headline, followed by Sky News, Channel 7, Channel 9. And because they're all lemmings without any independent thought, they ran with the same headlines, and this then became the narrative in the media. And without question, Albanese should have handled this situation in a much better way. And if shaming a politician is one way of getting action and funding on a very important issue, well, then that's what has to be done. And I think we do have to be cynical and sceptical about the motivations of politicians, but the results of what they do is more important. But the media used this opportunity to attack Albanese and the Labor government. It was ramped up by the Liberal Party. So we ended up getting 3 days of continuous attacks on the Prime Minister, that he lied about the briefing of whether he should speak or not. He was a bully. He made a young Indigenous DV activist cry, and that he had totally hijacked the event. So in the debate about who said what, the message about domestic violence and the government's response was completely drowned out, just so that the Conservative media could do its usual hatchet job on a Labor Prime Minister and a Labor government. So Albanese should have done much better, but the media should have also done much better as well. And this is not a protect Albanese moment. He did stuff up, there's no question about that. But as we know, every single error or misstep by anyone to do with the Labor government is magnified and blown out of all proportion. And I think this was yet another example of that.
One of the points that Anthony Albanese's his supporters said that he turned up and he was willing to listen, which is much more than a lot of other prime ministers, one in particular, was prepared to do. He didn't threaten the women backhandedly, although, although there's nuance to that too. His detractors, of course, said that he didn't do enough, that he made it all about him. Again, I suspect there's elements of truth on both sides, and I don't want to make a judgment. But I will say, if he hadn't turned up, we wouldn't have heard the end of it either. Where was the Prime Minister? The Prime Minister should be there, even if he'd sent the Minister for Women in his stead, even if he'd sent all the female cabinet members. You know, he did show up to be pilloried. Again, I don't want to discount those who thought that he behaved inappropriately. When the dust settles, we'll know the truth on all of this. But what it did show is that the media took the discussion away from the vital subject of violence against women and put it onto a debate over who did what at the rally. And that, to me, seemed to be wrong. Certainly report what happened at the rally, but to make it about what happened at the rally and not about what the rally was about, I think shows the Australian media and Australian debate to be in a really bad spot at the moment.
Oh, for sure, and I think that's the point that we are making, that there's so many problems within the Australian media, and just dissecting that media behaviour and looking at the videos of that event. And for what it's worth, I had a look at quite a few of the videos that were posted on social media from different vantage points, and the media portrayal of what happened was almost completely incorrect. It seemed like a confused situation. It was confusing. The event itself seemed disorganised. Was Albanese meant to speak or not to speak? Was he meant to be there or not meant to be there? Even though all of the publicity material from the organisers seemed to indicate that Albanese was going to be at the rally and he was going to address the rally. So who knows? But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. You know, as you mentioned before, David, maybe it would have been better or more appropriate for the Minister for Women, Katie Gallagher, to speak on behalf of the government, or Amanda Rishworth, the Social Services Minister, or Tanya Plibersek. But I think the point is that the media doesn't really care about domestic violence. They just care about the headline and the opportunity to attack a Labor government. And they're just really interested in getting the conflict story that sells the news. And that's why we get those, he was a really good bloke headline when there's a man who murders another woman, or about how good they might have been at football, or that they were the head prefect at school, or they get to be a newsreader on Channel 7 or appear on Dancing with the Stars, as is the case with former AFL player Ben Cousins, who is a serial perpetrator of domestic violence offences, or Wayne Carey, who glassed and abused his partner and is being inducted into the Hall of Fame for the AFL. And during all of this media outrage and misrepresentation about Albanese as the liar or just being as bad as Scott Morrison or imposing himself, the news about the $925 million response from the government at the National Cabinet meeting didn't get very much traction, nor did the issue of domestic violence overall. And during the time that the media decided to focus on a big divisive debate that was used to attack the government, 3 more women were killed by their abusive male partners. And the other point is that there were no Liberal Party MPs at the No More rallies anywhere around Australia. They actually used the entire incident to attack the Prime Minister and the Labor government politically on virtually every media outlet that they could find. And we have to remember that it was the coalition that continuously cut back funding to domestic violence programs when they were in office up until 2021, when they were forced to put some of that funding back into domestic violence programs after the revelations that they covered up sexual assault at Parliament House. So I think generally people will make their own judgments about all of this. At least we didn't hear anything about women protesters in other countries being met with bullets. But I think it's just another case where an important issue has been used by politics and the media for ulterior motivations.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. It's time that we grew up. It's time that the mainstream media grew up. The same week that we had this on, there was some vile thing about Kyle Sandilands wanting to know when women were having their periods. You know, just awful. And I know that they're trying to make as big a splash as possible in Melbourne, but how about trying to do something positive? We've got to change, and we've got to change now.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible, Google Podcasts and YouTube.
He told me don't wait forever. He told me don't wait until when I put my whole self into waiting. I thought I knew what he was saying, 'cause I had a boyfriend like him before. Had a boyfriend like him before. Now give me sweet.
Oh, I think it sort of built up. I couldn't put my finger on a particular time, but, you know, it was a very stressful period, and the combination of the weight of issues, the length of hours that we were working, the physical demands that brought, and to be honest, the stuff around China was as, if not more, distressing than the pandemic. And then you add to that particularly when you got into 2021. In 2020, there was a bit more of birth given, I think, in media and otherwise, and in politics, to just getting on with it and trying to save the country. Sort of politics as usual returned in 2021. Yeah. And so, you know, it was a pretty punishing time, and this all sort of compounded quite a bit. And, you know, you're flesh and blood.
He's a little bit like Banquo's ghost, and he's back. And this time, Scott Morrison has gone public and revealed that he was taking antidepressants for anxiety and depression. And David, I'm in two minds about this. Yes, issues relating to anxiety and depression should be discussed more openly and should be raised in public more often. And the more we have public figures talking about depression and anxiety, the less stigma there will be about these issues in the community. The Former Liberal Party MP Andrew Robb, he was the first federal MP to make a public disclosure about his mental health issues in 2016, and this was when he was still in politics. The Western Australia Premier Jeff Gallop, he resigned in 2006 due to issues related to depression, and he was quite public about that as well. Malcolm Turnbull revealed that he was suicidal after he was removed as Liberal Party leader in 2009. That was probably because of the guy who replaced him was Tony Abbott. Sports people have been coming out more often to reveal that they had mental health issues and need a break from the game. So it is good that people in public life are coming out to reveal these issues so that one day we won't have to congratulate people for coming out with their issues. It's just accepted as a health condition that needs to be treated just like you treat a broken arm or something else that you can see visually. But it's still hard to know what to think about Morrison's revelation. When he was in office, his government cut funding to mental health services, and for most of the time the coalition was in government, there were problems of access to mental health services. There was misdirected funding, a lack of coordination of mental health services across the country, high suicide rates in Indigenous communities. Medicare supported psychiatric and psychological visits were halved from 20 down to 10 per year. So it's all well and good to reveal the inner workings of someone's mind when they were the Prime Minister, but when Morrison was in government, he did little to support mental health services for the rest of the community.
The other thing too is how liberal he was with the truth during his time in office. We should encourage people to look after themselves. And if he needed this stuff, okay, he should have had it. But it's hard to have any sympathy for a guy who did all that, plus may not be telling the truth about it anyway. And the other thing too is that there are a lot of cynicism about it. There are some who think that he's putting it in as a preemptive defence for when he almost certainly faces the NACC. He can say, oh, I wasn't thinking clearly because I was mentally ill. And mental illness shouldn't be used as an excuse like that. Sure, there's diminished capacity and what have you. You can tell the real cases too. For the sports people who felt the pressure, for the genuine ones, all sympathy, all support, all encouragement for them to do that, and a lot of admiration for them coming out. You do get people who try and use their mental issues as a way of diminishing their own responsibility. And if there's one thing Morrison was always very good at, it was diminishing his own responsibility. I don't hold a housemate. I went on holidays because I'd promised Jen and the kids. It was a public service issue. I wasn't aware of stuff that I was clearly aware of. I may be being too harsh, but as someone who sees the response that Morrison had to mental illness, I find it very hard to have sympathy for him.
The other point is that mental health is also another big social and health issue that is overlooked, ignored, or not taken seriously by governments. It's the same with domestic violence. They will do the bare minimum because it's probably a case where they have a stigma about mental health issues, or that it's a hidden issue, or it's something that's either not talked about or can't be physically seen, so it's easily dismissed. And mental health services for young adults, that's an issue that's really overlooked. And for anyone that's got children who have suffered from these issues, they'd know how difficult it is to access services in most parts of Australia, and that's whether it's private or government supported. There are big issues with access. So this is a continuing issue, and sure, having someone in public life, especially a former Prime Minister, to come and talk about their struggles, well, I think that's a good thing. And you just have to wonder what it is in Morrison's case. He's got a new book coming out, and this seems to be part of the pre-release promotion cycle. Every couple of months he'll appear in the media and people say, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know that about Scott Morrison. And then you realise that he's talking about something that's in his upcoming book. And we also have to remember that Scott Morrison was absolutely brutal on mental health. As Immigration Minister, he totally demonised asylum seekers. He kept children in immigration detention. As Social Services Minister, he presided over the robo-debt scheme that's destroyed the lives of thousands of people. As Treasurer, he cut back mental health services. So it's pretty obvious that Morrison is a very self-centred person, and he's just thinking about promoting his book. And yes, like I said, and like we keep saying, it's good that a former Prime Minister comes out to say that they battled with anxiety and depression, but so do so many other people in the community. And he wasn't really thinking about them too much when he did so much damage to the mental health of the nation.
It shows, yet again, why he was unfit to be in public office. He was unfit to be a backbencher. If he was that sick, he should have got the care. And that's, I'm not going to judge anyone who needs the care. If you need the care, you need the care, and you should get the care. If he, as I reluctantly suspect, he wasn't that sick, he shouldn't be using it as a way of garnering sympathy or popularity. The sooner that we hear nothing from him, I think, the better. And I don't say that about every Prime Minister. I think it's okay to hear from ex-Prime Ministers every now and then on certain things, even the ones I disagree with. But I don't think we ever need to hear from Scott Morrison again.
And you could argue that the Labor government is not much better on this front. They did actually increase the funding for mental health services by $42 million in 2023, but that's actually below the rate of inflation. The coalition increased psychiatric and psychological visits from 10 to 20 in the early parts of COVID, and that was due to revert back to 10 at the end of 2022. But the Labor government didn't actually do anything to change that, and it kept it at 10 per year. But it's always the same issue. Why don't we have enough money for mental health services? Why is it a case where it just has to be argued for every single budget, every single year? The federal budget for all mental health related services is $4.3 billion per year. And according to the Productivity Commission, the cost to the economy from issues related to poor mental health and suicide is around $180 billion per year. And David, that's a massive amount. Government should spend more, and they would save the economy more. And it should be possibly seen as some sort of insurance scheme, but I guess governments don't see it in the way. And as you mentioned, we've got that ridiculous AUKUS deal. That will cost $380 billion over its duration. Probably going to be a lot more than that, and it's around $10 billion each year. And that's for getting old bits of naval scrap metal and some old submarines that the US can't sell to anyone else, but improving the mental health of the nation so that the community lives in a much better way and increases economic productivity. Well, that's just too difficult to achieve. And it's the same issue that we always come back to on this podcast. Government should tax in a much better way. Tax the resources that are being sold for a song overseas, tax the right areas of the economy, not the areas that make it more difficult for the community. That's where the priority should be. And if we did this, there'd be a mental health service on every street corner, and people who need assistance wouldn't have to battle through a system that is so difficult to navigate through.
And again, mental illness is tied into violence against women. The trauma needs to be managed or treated or compassionately looked after, pick whichever. Education, where we can educate people how to behave, where we can have full employment, all the stuff that we should be spending money on, we're not. And all the stuff that we don't really need to be spending money on, we're throwing at like there's an infinite amount of money. Now, I know that technically there is an infinite amount of money in that governments can print up as much money as they like, and then they just have to deal with the inflation. But given that they've decided that this is how much money we're going to spend, it's time to change the priorities. Doesn't mean we get rid of the Defence Forces. Doesn't mean that we don't have international relations with other countries. It doesn't mean that we don't pay politicians. But it does mean that we can rethink how we do this stuff. Even goes down to tax collection. If Labor is listening, it's time to stop being timid and start to reform the country in much more positive and effective and constructive ways.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should.